Hello and welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to share with you 6 deadly traps that you can use in the Ruy Lopez, the most common opening plate from the beginners to the grandmasters level. Some may also call it as the Spanish opening. Now let's get started. It starts with e4, black responds with e5, knight f3, knight c6. Instead of playing the Italian, playing the bishop to c4, we play our bishop to b5, attacking the knight on the c6 square. Now, there are various ways how black can respond, but the most common one is a normal developing move playing the knight to f6. Idea behind knight f6 to attack our e4 pawn. Now, we ignore the threat and we simply castle. We can also play a knight to c3, but there's a trap coming ahead. So, you castle. After castling, if he gets greedy and captures your pawn on the e4 square, now see, you're already giving an attack to the e5 pawn with your knight. We have one attacker, one defender. Now, the knight is also come in the same file as that of the pawn. You can give an attack to this knight by playing your rook to e1. If this knight goes back, now what can he do? If the knight goes back, then you win the pawn. And if he defends it, let's say he defends it with his pawn to d5, the idea is not only defending this, but is also trying to open up the diagonal of this bishop. I mean, what else can you ask from a move? But this is actually a losing error. Here, you can still give an attack to the knight. You play a pawn to d3. Doesn't matter whether knight goes to f6 or d6, trying to give an attack to your bishop. You first capture on the e5 square with your knight. Now see, you are trying for a discovered check as well as you're pinning this knight. So this is double attacked by your knight and the bishop, and the king is also in danger. Now here, if he tries to capture your bishop on the b5 square, well, it is lost because you can now capture the knight, give a discovered check and an attack on the queen. Even if he tries to defend the queen, you are going to simply capture it. So you win the queen there. Okay. So what if he's not doing the losing error? If what is he's not playing his pawn to d5, directly moving his knight back to the f6 square. Then also we can go and capture the pawn on the e5 square. Now if the knight captures it back on e5, we don't immediately need to recapture it. We have already pinned this knight to the king. So what we can do is we can give an attack to this knight by playing a pawn to d4. The point here is after you capture on e5 square, you give an attack to the knight. The knight on the f6 will have no good squares to go to and will have to go back on its home rank. Also, it's better to play a pawn in the center than a rook. Here, if your opponent tries to give an attack to your bishop by playing his pawn to c6, well, that's a total disaster for black because now you capture on the e5 square. That also gives an attack to the knight on f6. If he captures on b5, then capturing on the f6 comes with a discovered check. The king has no good squares to go to, will only have to block and will lose one more piece. Here you can recapture it with the pawn, you can recapture it with the rook, but the better option is to get it with the rook because that also gives a check. Now the king has only one square to go, is to go on the f8 square, and then you can win in various ways, but the easiest one is to play your queen to d6, trying for a discovered attack, trying for a discovered check. The king comes out of this check. Now you play a bishop to h6. Idea is simple. You want to go queen g6, queen g3 and give a checkmate over here. If he captures your bishop, then queen g king goes on the f8 square. You are going to give a checkmate on the next move. So that was trap number 1 for you. Now let's have a look at the trap from the black side. Here after bishop b5, what if black player tries to kick off your bishop by playing their pawn to a6? Then obviously we'll have to save our bishop and we'll have to go back. Where can we go? We can go back on the a4 square, trying to maintain your bishop in the same diagonal that if in future he plays his pawn to d6, it will be a pin to the king. Right? Here you do actually play a pawn to d6. Now this is a little move, but that kind of helps. You know what? Contender for World Championship match, challenger 2 times to Magnus Carlsen and Dingleren, Jan Nepomuceno has fallen for this trap. He has played his pawn to d. The opponent played the pawn to d6. Now, what does this pawn to d6 move do? Is provoke your opponent to take advantage along this pin. He can now play his pawn to d4 with the idea to play pawn d5 and take advantage of the pin. The best way to take advantage of a pin is to give an attack with the pawn. He can also try to capture on the e5 square. So we are provoking him to play his pawn to d4, and in many cases your opponent might do that. Here, now you first unpin your knight, play your pawn to b5, give an attack to the bishop. The bishop has to go back, and now you want to do exchanges in this position to get your trap. So you first capture on the d4 square with your knight. Capture on the d4 square with the knight captures it back, and now you capture with the pawn. The queen takes it. Here you can give an attack to the queen by playing your pawn to c5. Idea is wherever the queen goes next, you are going to play your pawn to c4 and this bishop is trapped. This bishop will have no good squares to go to. If your opponent tries to dodge you for a move, let's say he places queen to d5, creating a battery along this f7 square and also giving an attack to your rook at the same time. This is a double attack, but one small move can solve all your problem. You can just play a bishop to e6, give an attack to the queen, saving the f7 square. Also, the queen defends the rook on the a8 square. So every problem is solved. Now, there's one last hope that he has is to give a check on the c6 square, but you block that check as well by playing a bishop to e7. Now, if he again goes on the d5 square with his queen, trying for the same attack on f7, well, now you can just cut off the battery by playing your pawn to c4 and winning the bishop on spot. Alright, let's have a look at trap number 3. After bishop b5, if the opponent plays his pawn to a6, the bishop comes back. And now here, if he plays his knight to f6, we do the normal developing move. We simply castle over here. And if he does the normal development, just like us, if he plays his bishop to c5, as we do in the Italian game, then you just strike in the center. You play your knight to e5, capturing the pawn. If the knight captures it back, then you can play a pawn to d4. That's a double attack, attacking the bishop as well as the knight, getting your piece back with interest. Here, most of the players will play their bishop to d4, capturing the pawn on the d4 square, then queen takes it back. Knight has to save itself, and next your idea, look at your pieces so strong in the center, the bishop's diagonals are open, and you are doing very well with the white pieces. Here the knight is in danger. If the knight goes back on the c6 square trying to hit your queen, then you can first exchange the knight and later you can play a pawn to e5, giving an attack to this knight. There's only one good square I feel for the knight to go is to go on the d5 square, and then you can launch the attack in various ways. You can play your queen to g4. If not, even if e5, you can first play a bishop to g5 as well. Now here, if you play queen g4, hitting the pawn on the g7 square, and if he castles, then that is again a blunder for him because you can now go bishop h6, hitting the g7 square with the checkmating idea. He will have to block it, and now you can simply capture the rook, and that is completely winning for white. Alright, now coming to trap number 4. After knight c6, bishop b5, we play our pawn to a6. What if the opponent is not going back on the a4 square? Instead, he is simply capturing your knight on c6 square. Then, you can capture it back with your d pawn. And now if he does the developing move like castling, then you can play your bishop to g4, pairing this knight to the queen. If he gives an attack to your bishop, then you play the famous fishing pole gambit. You play a pawn to h5, giving away the bishop. He captures your bishop, you can recapture it with the pawn, giving an attack to the knight. Your idea is next to get the queen in the h file. Now this rook acts as a monster. It's a battery with the heavy pieces on the h file, and it will result to a checkmate eventually. Here, if he tries to defend the knight by playing on the h2 square, then you go with the queen to h4, attacking this knight again. If he is trying to create some room for his king to escape after queen h2, he is trying to escape from the f2 square, you just lock the door by playing a pawn to g3. Sooner or later, it is definitely going to be a checkmate. It is a very famous fishing pole. Alright, it is time for trap number 5. Now, after bishop b5 here, instead of kicking the bishop away, you can play a knight to f6. Here, if he places his pawn to d3, trying to defend the pawn on the e4 square instead of castling, he is playing his pawn to d3, trying to defend the pawn on the e4 square. Then you play this strange little move. You play a knight to e7. Now, what happened with knight e7 is you have given up this free pawn on the e5 square. If your opponent thinks that, okay, you have just mistaken and has done a dubious move by playing your knight to e7 and he tries to capture your pawn on e5, well, then you can now play your pawn to c6, attack this bishop. Doesn't matter where the bishop goes. Queen a5 comes with a triple attack, giving a check, trying to win the knight and eventually the bishop as well. Okay. But what if the opponent doesn't fall for the trap? What if, let's say, he does a normal looking move like if he castles? Then also you can play a bishop pawn to c6, attack the bishop goes back, and now you can just play a knight to g6 with a good development, and your knight is ready to protect the pawn on e5, is ready to jump in on the f4 square. In the middle game ideas can be to play the knight to h5, one of the knight to f4, bringing the queen in and attacking on the king side. Okay, time for the last trap, trap number 6. After bishop b5, if he tries to kick away the bishop, playing the pawn to a6, which is the normal move, which is the classical variation, you get back the bishop on the a4 square. Now, when he develops normally, like playing his knight to f6, then you do the sideline here. You can play your queen to e2, trying to protect the e4 pawn. We have seen castling, then what happens if the knight captures. We have seen pawn d3. Now we are looking at the move queen to e2, protecting this pawn on e4 square. Now he might think that his pawn actually on e5 is in danger, because you can anytime capture over here. Whenever he captures it back with any pawn b or d, his pawn on the e5 will be lost, right? Okay, if he tries to defend that threat and plays his pawn to b5, then you come back with the bishop to b3. Now when he plays his bishop to e7, that the threat is gone. You can no more capture on the e5 square. Let's say he plays his bishop to e7. Now you do this flank move. You play a pawn to a4. Here your idea is, if you capture, he cannot recapture it because the rook attacks the rook. Also, you have the queen protecting along this diagonal. If he captures on the a4 square with his pawn, then you capture it back with the bishop. Next, you are going to capture the knight, and he will have isolated pawns, and the pawn structure will be completely ruined. So what best bet he has is to play his pawn to b4. After he pushes up his pawn on b4 square, we are going to go with another attack, this time in the center, playing a pawn to d4. If he captures your pawn on the d4 square with e takes on d4, then you can push the pawn up on e5. The knight will have to go back on the original square, and later you can capture on the d4 square. And if he realizes that the pawn is going to push forward on the e5 square, and that will be a threat for black, what he can do is, instead he can just play his pawn to d6, defending the e5 pawn. Then you play your queen to c4. The idea behind queen c4 is to give a checkmate on the f7 square with the help of this battery. Also, it is giving a double attack to the knight on the c6 square, and you will either win the game or you are going to win the knight. So this was 6 deadly trap in the most common opening played, the Ruy Lopez or the Spanish opening. For more such amazing tricks and traps, stay tuned with us. Till the time, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share with your chess friends. Thank you.